Let's talk about Vrui's user interface and how to get you started on your Vrui journey. And specifically I'm talking about the user interface as set up for Valve Index headsets and Valve Index controllers, as you can see. And first off, the Index controllers do finger tracking, as you can see with this very crude hand model. And when you're starting up a session for the first time, when you're starting up a session by starting the OpenVR tracker, the first time you run an application, you might want to wiggle your fingers a little bit so that the controllers can calibrate themselves to your hand shape and more reliably detect your gestures. Otherwise, you're just going to be running into problems later on. Just, as a reminder. But with that out of the way, the first thing I want to talk about is navigation. And in Vrui lingo, navigation is how you change the mapping from navigation space, which is the space in which the application works, like this particular application, which is a molecular dynamics simulation that runs in a molecular space. These are individual atoms, so this is only a few nanometers to the side, to the physical space where I am, which is the environment that I set up. And by default, we are using a two-handed navigation tool on the index that works actually very simple. It uses the grip buttons on the index controllers, which are pressure sensitive. So what you do is you just reach into your space, and more on that later, and then you just gently squeeze one controller handle, like here my left hand, and you notice how the entire world, not just an individual object, but the entire world becomes attached to my left hand right now. I can translate, I can rotate, and if I let go of the controller, it just stays in the place where it was, and I can pick it up again, and I can keep moving. So I can explore freely, I can pick up this thing over here and move around. You get the idea. I can do the same thing with the other hand, it's ambidextrous, so I can just essentially pass the world between my hands and very intuitively move around and inspect things. There's also a thing I can do that you can't do in the real world, which is I can change the scaling, and Vrui is a little bit unusual in that regard. I can change the scale between the virtual world and the real world. And I do that by using both hands at the same time. For example, I reach and I grab one object by just squeezing the controller handles, and then with the other hand I'm grabbing another point in space, and then if I move my hands together, you see how the virtual world becomes a lot smaller, and if I pull my hands apart, it becomes bigger. And of course I can ratchet that as well. I just let go, I grab again, I let go, grab again. Now the world is super, super tiny, still way bigger than in real life, given that these are atoms. And then I can also make it ginormously large. And it turns out the idea is that you can work at any scale that is convenient for a particular application. I like to work with things when they're at arm's reach, when they're floating right in front of me, and I can conveniently grab every part of what I want to work with and then do stuff. Like I mentioned, that is of course application specific, and this here is a molecular dynamics simulation. We're going to see more about that in a bit. But there's one thing I want to mention. You can touch anywhere and grab to move the entire space, because you're not, again, picking up an individual object, you're picking up all of space. So it doesn't matter what you grab. You can grab outside the box even. There's nothing special about the box as far as model space is concerned. But there's one exception to that, and that is when you are scaling. Because when you scale, you always scale around the point, and the point on the controller is the tip of that gray cone there. You scale around the point that you initially grabbed. So if I start by grabbing this particular tetrahedron here, and then I scale, you notice how that particular point stays exactly in the same spot and everything scales around it. So what happens if I start by grabbing a point that's not on any of the objects but outside my model, and then I scale in? And what happens is that the object or the entire world not only becomes bigger, but it also moves away from me. And so this is kind of weird. Our brains are not quite sure how to deal with that. And so it becomes quite confusing, and it's really easy to get lost. And now things are super far away, and if I'm trying to interact, I can't, because everything is super far away. And so if you get into that, the best way of getting out of it is to just make everything super small, and then you can grab things again as usual. And the way to not get into it in the first place is to kind of be mindful that before you start zooming, you just scaling, not zooming, you grab the object that you're interested in, like this buckyball over here, and then you scale in, and then it will not move away, but it will stay exactly where it was, and you will not get lost, and you will have a good time. So just keep that in mind. But the recap is, to pick up space and translate and rotate it, you just grab with one hand and just do this. You can use the other hand, and if you use both hands at the same time, you can change scale. You can also just move by using both hands at the same time, but I actually don't see the point in that because it's easier to do with a single hand. Okay, so that covers the basics of default navigation. Now, this is just the default navigation tool. There are other ones in Vrui, and we are going to talk about them at a later point. But this is the one that is already existing when you start up any Vrui application, unless the application tells the system otherwise. And so you're going to encounter this one basically all the time. Okay, now after this direct manipulation thing, let's talk about a little bit indirect manipulation and interaction with more traditional 2, or I would say 2.5 dimensional graphical user interfaces. And the way you interact with these GUI elements in the index setup is that you make this interaction gesture where you just stretch out your index finger and you take your thumb off the top of the controller like this. You make this finger gun gesture essentially. And you noticed a menu popped up. And this is the application's main menu. You can see by the name of the application, Nanotech Construction Kit at the top. And then all of these menu entries are application-specific entries. And the way that you select an entry is by, while you have the interaction gesture going, you just poke the menu with your fingertip like this. And so I now poke the Vrui system menu entry, where these are all system-wide settings. These are application independent. And you notice I just keep my finger poked in, pull over, and then I can select all these other submenus and even more submenus. You get the idea. And so in order now to make a selection, what you do is you have two options. You can either just unpoke by pulling your index finger out of the menu, or you can stop making the menu gesture by putting your thumb back on the controller. Let's do the first one first. I pull my index finger out and I make the selection, and now I'm showing the scale bar, which I'm now moving around. We're talking about that later. And I'm going to drop it by stopping the interaction gesture by putting my thumb back on the controller like this. And then I bring the menu up again by putting my thumb up. And if I now want to hide the scale bar, in this case I'm going to select this menu entry by bringing my thumb back in like this, and I made the selection, the scale bar is gone. So to recap, you bring up a menu or you interact with any widget by making the gesture, and then you poke things with your index finger. And so this is for menus, and now let's say you have a freestanding dialog window, and I'm going to use the collaboration settings window because you're probably going to actually run into that one, and I'm going to select this one by stopping the gesture. And so now the dialog pops up right where the menu used to be. And it looks like a very standard two-dimensional GUI window. And I can actually move that around by poking the title bar. I make the interaction gesture, I poke the title bar, the dialog becomes attached to my index finger, I can move it wherever, and if I find the place where I want it, now I can't stop doing this by pulling my finger out because it's stuck to my finger, but I can stop making the gesture just by doing this, and the dialog window stays where it is. Before I talk about anything else, I also want to mention these two buttons in the title bar. This one, as you can imagine, closes the dialog window, and this one here minimizes. And I want to show very quickly how that works. I poke it, and the dialog is gone, but it's not really closed. So the question is now, where is it? How do I get it back? And the answer is you go to the main menu, you go to Vrui System, you go to Dialogs, and there is an entry for that dialog. You select, and there it is again. There's another thing that you can do, and when the dialog is still shown and you do the same thing and you go to the dialogs menu, then what will happen is it will directly teleport to your finger. So if you're moving somewhere else and you forgot a dialog window behind, you can always bring it back by just doing this, and then it becomes immediately attached to your finger, and you can place it again wherever you want and then let go of it and it will stay. And then you see here a very standard, albeit a bit clunky looking UI. Here we have, I should mention that this application is actually collaborative, even though I'm currently the only one in this shared space. So if there were any other users, their names would show up in this list box to the left. And there are this is a notebook essentially with 4 tabs. There are tabs for a couple of sub-protocols of the collaboration protocol. There's the Vrui core protocol, which is the core as the name implies. I can make some global changes here. I can change my name. I'm going to talk about how to do that later. I can just, by poking it again, I can turn off certain settings, can toggle these buttons. If I had a list of clients and I were to select one of them by poking them, I could then here do some per client or per user selections. I can follow them. I can see whether they are following me. I can face them. That's a whole other story. Then we can go to the group chat protocol, which is called Agoda. And that one I can, for example, I have a slider here, which I can interact with by just poking the handle and then dragging it. and this will change the volume of my microphone. If I can calibrate it so that it's not too loud, not too soft, that people can understand me. I can quickly mute myself by hitting the mute button here. If I select another user on the left here, I can change their settings. I can change their volume. If they're too loud or too soft, I can totally mute them if you're talking rubbish as it goes, but I can't do that right now because there are no other users. Just want to mention ensomatosis is the avatar protocol. Right now I don't see my inverse kinematics avatar. I can show it, and then here is my beautiful robot body. This is how the other users in the system are currently seeing me, but it's not really necessary, so I can unselect that. You get the idea. It's a pretty straightforward thing with poking and having the usual 2D UI widgets and interacting with them. I want to finally go ahead and actually close this dialog. And before I move on to something else, I want to briefly go back to something I already mentioned before, and that's the scale bar, because it's kind of important. If you go to the system menu, there's an NT for show scale bar. You show it, and this is also a dialog window. It just doesn't look like one. And you can place this anywhere, stop making the gesture, and there it is. And so this essentially, this shows you the scale between the virtual world and the real world. So the length of this bar is indicated by the value below. So this bar is currently 50 angstroms long. And then up here is the scale factor from virtual space to real space, which is currently 50 million to 1, which makes about sense given that this is a fragment of a zeolite crystal, and this is a buckyball, a C60 Buckminster fullerene. So these are, of course, very, very, very small objects. And if I do the interactive scaling, if I just move space like this, the scale obviously doesn't change, but if I scale by using both hands, then you notice how the scale bar reacts immediately. And always shows me the proper scale, and it automatically adapts the length of this bar to kind of fit your space. So now this bar is only 20 angstroms long. You get the idea. And there's also another way to change scale, which is by directly essentially clicking using the interaction gesture on the left or right parts of the scale bar. This one scales around the environment center, which is here, so it's going to look a little bit weird. If I tap here, it's going to go to the next map scale. So now it's 1 times 10 to the 8 to 1, 2 times 10 to the 8 to 1, 5 times 10 to the 8 to 1, 1 times 10 to the 9 to 1, you get the idea. And on the left, I will zoom in again. And if I want to move the scale bar, I can just tap it in the middle and then stop making the gesture. You get the idea. To get rid of it, because it doesn't have a close button, I go to the system menu and again select show scale bar, and it's gone. So that much about menu interaction. As you can see, is pretty straightforward. The only thing to keep in mind is that you interact not by pointing, but by touching with the tip of your index finger. Here's a simulation dialog, just more sliders. This is now application specific. I can change attenuation factors, what have you. It's pretty straightforward. So then the next thing to talk about is to answer the question, okay, we talked about what the grip button does. It lets you move space, but what do all the other buttons do? And the answer is that Vrui here is a little bit different from, I'm guessing, many other VR systems, in that the applications don't have hard-coded user interfaces. They have no hard-coded mappings between controller buttons and what happens in the application. The way that works is that you assign those things as the user. You assign these things dynamically. So what happens? Let's say, how do I assign then a function to the trigger button on the right controller, which currently doesn't do anything? Well, it's very simple. You press the button and hold it. And Vrui, knowing that there's currently no function associated with that button, that was a tracking glitch, will show you a tool selection menu where you can select, okay, what do I want to do with the button? Do I want to use it as a laser pointer, or as a flashlight, or a clipping plane? Or do I want to do some application-specific function, which is indicated by the name of the program here? For example, I want to pick a complex, and then I want to make the selection. I now point at the pick complex entry and let go of the button. And now there is a pick complex tool on my trigger button, and it's actually indicated here. This red sphere is a component of that tool, which become obvious in a moment. The idea here is that this tool let me pick up complexes of connected building blocks, like this zeolite crystal here. The way it works is very simple. I touch any of the building blocks with the red sphere, press and hold the button, and the entire complex becomes rigidly attached to my hand. You notice there's a little bit of lag there. That's because the simulation actually runs on a remote server, and my network connection is not the best one. So I can move this thing around, and you notice the difference between moving an individual object with this special tool and moving the entire space using the grip button. This moves everything. It moves this object and that one and the box, and this only moves this object or obviously this object. And you can do both at the same time with the expected results. I just wanted to point out the difference between moving space and moving an individual object. Okay, so to reiterate, to create a tool and bind it to a button, you just press the button. I'm now going to press the trigger button on the left controller. The menu pops up, and then you select what you want to do. Let's say I want to pick individual units. You release, and now there's a tool on that button indicated here. And so this tool is different. This one here, as I mentioned, picks an entire complex, and this one picks an individual unit. And you can immediately see the difference. Now we get the actual interaction that the simulation does, where it simulates the connection between these atoms. You can rip it out if you overcome the bonding force, and then if you bring the bonding point, the corners of these tetrahedra close to each other, it's going to snap back into place. This is just this specific application. It's not really important for this. I just wanted to mention how you can assign different tools. So the idea is that as a user, you set up your own controller environment. There's a whole bunch of different functions, as you saw from all the different options you have in this menu here. There's a whole bunch of application-specific tools. So you realize that sooner or later you're going to run out of buttons if you're doing all these things at the same time. And so what do you do then? Well, you can dynamically create tools in the way we just showed, and you can also dynamically delete tools. And the way that that works is that you have this virtual, you can't see it right now because it's to the right of my head, you have this virtual trash can floating to the right of your head, sort of outside from your right ear. By default, it can be anywhere you want, you can configure that. So what you do is, if you want to, let's say, delete the tool on the right controller's trigger button, you move the right controller into this trash can, in which case you get a little haptic tick, like tuk, and then you just click the button that you want to release. And now you notice the red sphere is gone, and if I press the trigger button again, there's no function attached to it anymore, so Vrui again shows me the tool selection menu, and I can now pick another tool. I can, for example, pick a create silicate unit tool, which if I press the button now in empty space, it will make a new silicate unit. These tetrahedra are silicate units. There's a silicon atom in the middle, and then 4 oxygen atoms in the corners, which are shared between adjacent building blocks. That's how they bond to each other. It's irrelevant right now. And if I pick an existing one, I can move it around. So the idea here is that, again, you can the controller just lost tracking of my ring finger. The idea is that you can set up fairly complex input systems. I call them input graphs because you can actually stack these tools to achieve all kinds of special effects. You can map tools to surfaces. It's not important right now, but the point is you can set this all up to your liking. So the question now is, do you have to do that again every time you start an application? And I wouldn't be asking the question if the answer wasn't no. The way to save your current tool bindings is you bring up the main menu and you go to Vrui System, you go to Devices, and you go to Save Input Graph, which will show you a pretty standard looking file selection dialog. And you can now just save this input graph. And here's maybe a good time where I can talk about something that is not so much fun in VR, and that is entering text. So if you want to change the file name from the default of saved input graph 0001.input graph, how do I actually enter text? And Vrui has also a bunch of different ways of doing that, but the default is the one I kind of prefer. It's not a virtual keyboard, or not quite one. It's something that has a bit of a learning curve maybe, but once you get used to it a little bit, it's actually much faster than using a virtual keyboard. And this is this so-called QuikWrite method, which I didn't invent, was invented by Ken Perlin. And the idea is that you can enter arbitrarily long text by just making sweeping gestures with your finger. You don't ever have to press a button. You don't have to hunt and peck on a virtual keyboard. Again, takes a little bit getting used to, but the idea is you have these characters aligned around a central area, and so you can select a character by moving from the central area to one of these leaves. Let's say I want to type an N, then the N is right here in the corner, so I go up to the corner, and because the N is in the corner, I go straight back to the middle, and I just typed an N. And then if I want to type a C, you'll see the C is right here. So what I do is I go to the left, and then because the C is down, I go down, and then back to the middle, and I have a C. And then the K is in the top left, so I go top left, and then you see it's all the way to the right, so I move all the way to the right and back to the middle, and now I have NCK. And if I want to have it uppercase, I can just go backspace, just left, 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 and then uppercase is this triangle here, so I can go up and to the right and down. Now it's uppercase, and then I go again N and uppercase and C and uppercase. I can also go uppercase twice to do caps lock, but I didn't want to do it right now, and then K. And then I confirm by going to the down arrow, which is on the bottom left, and there we have nck.input graph, and then I press OK. This seems a little bit weird, but it's actually, once you get used to it, it's really quite quick. It's called QuikWrite for a reason. Okay, that covers it. So what we went over in this video was 3 different things primarily. We talked about the basics of navigation, which you're going to be using almost all the time, where you use either hand and pick up space. You can use both hands to not only move space, but also scale it. We talked about interaction with menus and dialog windows by using the interaction gesture, and then just poking things with your index finger, like, show Vrui settings, and then go to and change the unit, which makes no sense whatsoever. Oops, my middle finger just went off the controller. Controller's having a hard time today. Come on, what's going on here? Anyway, here we go, and they have a usual drop down, and I can go from angstrom to kilometers, which makes absolute 0 sense, but Vrui doesn't care. It's up to you. Now the scale bar is in kilometers, and this is 50 kilometers. Makes no sense. Let's go back to angstroms. Here we go. That makes a lot more sense. And we can change lights or the color. I can change the background color to some really ugly, let's see, to some really weird orange. You get the idea. And then finally we talked about how to create tools and how to delete them. By deleting a tool, you bring the controller that you want to delete from into the tool kill zone to your right, and click the button you want to free, and then the tool is gone, and then you can create a new one. And that pretty much covers it. That should get you started on your journey into using Vrui. So I wish you best of luck, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.